Hello everyone, my name is Scott Asai. I help tech companies close a soft skills gap so they can maximize performance and retention. I'm a keynote speaker and recently did a TEDx talk in Hawaii entitled Saving Soft Skills from Extinction. Today, I'll be talking about how soft skills get hard results. But let me start with some context. In the IT industry, you were probably hired for a technical role based on your hard skills. If you achieve well, you get promoted. Promoted to a middle management position where now your job is to manage the people that you were peers with. It's a completely different skill set, and what worked for you before won't work for you now. Let me explain. I'd like you to think back to your favorite manager and think of it in terms of this quote. People don't leave companies, they leave managers. Did you know that micromanagers cost companies more money in retention and performance than any other factor? And you know why? Because most of the time they lack soft skills. So go back to thinking about your favorite manager. I bet if you thought about it, things that will come to your mind are, he or she listened to me. They appreciated me. I felt valued. See, these things are all soft skills. Things that we don't always learn in a classroom. We definitely don't learn on a new orientation. But these are things that we learn over time through practice. So today, we're going to focus on improving your soft skills. And the three areas I'm going to hone in on are communication, leadership, and emotional intelligence. So let's begin with communication. Communication. How do you define it? The definition of communication is simply exchanging information. The how matters more than the what. It's the reason why text messages get misinterpreted. It's because we put our own worldview and our own interpretation on things that we can't visually see. But what we really need to do is we need to learn how to actively listen to understand. So right now in this pandemic, we're limited and really don't have too much face time with people in person. So we settle for video calls, phone calls, text messaging, emails. The problem is that as you go down to something like an email or a text message, we lose a lot of nonverbal communication. You don't hear tone, you don't see body language, and it's really difficult to understand how someone's saying something. And the question when it comes to active listening is, are you listening to respond or problem solve? Because if you're not, you're going to miscommunicate. For an example, being in a relationship with my wife, a lot of times when she wants to vent, she doesn't really want me to solve her problem. She just wants me to listen. And if I try to solve her problem, she may actually feel like I'm not listening. Unfortunately, I learned the hard way. But what I'm trying to get across is that actively listening is really listening to be curious, listening to try to understand, not with an agenda, not trying to fix a problem, but actually just listening and trying to clarify what it is that the person is trying to say. Think about it in a work setting. When you think about your manager, does he or she listen to what you're really saying? Now, eventually, of course, you want them to give you the resource that's going to help you do your job better. But in that moment, what you really want is someone just to listen to you. And a lot of times we don't think of listening as part of communication because we think it's all about talking. But some of the best communicators have an ability to be great listeners. And that's something that we all need to strive to do. Because we're in the situation that we are right now, as much as you can, I would highly recommend that you set up video calls versus phone calls or emails. And eventually when things turn around and we're able to meet in person, or people feel comfortable meeting in person, then I would definitely put that on the top of the list. And the reason why is, once again, is that you lose so much when you don't have that in-person communication. There's a lot that goes on with communication that we see. And when we don't see those things, it's difficult to pick up and really understand what the person's trying to say. I think what's tough is communication really is a two-way street. And if you really try to clarify what someone's trying to say, that is truly what active listening is. Honestly, the advice piece is actually optional. Like I said before, a lot of times people don't want the advice because ultimately if they're going to stick with something, they want the information to make their own decision. That makes their decision a lot more independent. Let's take a peek into a conversation where active listening is actually happening. So if you're having a conversation with your boss and you're complaining about one of your coworkers to them, the last thing you want them to do is to take the other person's side, right? Now, I'm not saying that your boss should always agree with you, but what I am saying from the person who's doing the communication or the talking is that what you're really looking for is you're looking for your boss or manager to hear you out. You really just want to vent at that time. You want to feel safe. You want to feel like that person, you can trust that person. And a lot of times what happens is that a boss or manager feels like they need to solve your problem. And quite frankly, even if they did, is that going to be the best solution for you? No, it's not. Because they don't have the issue with the coworker, you do. So the more they can help you and resource you with the tools to be able to solve your own problems, that actually empowers you. And by that, are they really telling you what to do? Probably not. They're probably just asking the right questions to unlock the answers. So your goal in terms of communication and being a great listener is to listen for clarity. So when someone says something to you, before you respond, just clarify back to them what they said. And when you ask them for clarification, and they say, yes, that's exactly what I was trying to say, from that point, you've already made progress. But a lot of times we just rush through it. And we're so concerned about rushing through the conversation or just solving the problem. And that may be a band-aid. That may get the short-term solution. But in the long term, it doesn't do anything. So your goal as a communicator is to help other people solve their own challenges and problems. Because ultimately, that promotes independence and ownership on their part. Let's move on to leadership. What's your definition of leadership? Leadership is getting things done through people. Now that may sound a little harsh, even impersonal to a certain degree. But leadership has a relationship component and it has a task component. Okay? So think of a boat that's flowing down a still lake or pond. And think about the wake that it leaves. It leaves in two directions. think of one side as a relationship you have with people as a leader, and think of the other side as the tasks that need to get done under that person's leadership. Leadership is being able to balance both. And quite frankly, a lot of times, it's a lot less technical than we may think. So to go back to that example of when you got hired and now it's time for a promotion to middle management, you literally have to learn a new skill. You know why? Because you're in a new role. So whatever skills helped you get promoted to this position aren't necessarily going to serve you as well in your new role. Because now your job isn't to be the best widget maker. Your job is to bring the best out of the widget makers that are under your leadership. And that's a completely different mindset shift. As a personal example, years back, I worked at a test prep company, an online test prep company. And my role there was as a faculty manager. I had about 30 tutors who were under my leadership. And because it was a remote company, my first challenge was to understand how to build my relationship with them. So when I first met with each of them, virtually for 30 minutes per week, I wanted to build a profile. I wanted to ask them a lot of questions. I wanted to ask them questions about themselves. I wanted to know them as people. And I think all good leaders understand that each person is different. Their motivations, their triggers, their personality. And when you think back to your favorite leader, they probably treated you as an individual, not as a corporate person, not as a collective team. Now, I'm not saying that you always have the luxury of that time. But what I am saying is that if you really want to build that relationship, you really want to build that trust and empathy, you will make the time as a leader. Because ultimately, that's what's going to help you. So going back to my example of building a profile, of all the questions that I asked, and I asked plenty of them, the question that I found was the most disarming was, how can I support you? I remember some of the looks on the faces of the people across the video screen to this day. I think some of them were perplexed. I think some of them were caught off guard. I think some of them weren't sure how to answer that question. But the reason why I asked that question is because I wanted to know how to deal with that person when things got stressful. Because they were going to get stressful. And so my focus was more so on the person over the task. Because how you say something really matters. I'm not saying that what you say doesn't matter. I'm just saying how you say it really matters. So when I was able to get that answer from them and understand, okay, when things get stressful, do you want me to try to help you problem solve? Do you want me to give you space? Or would you rather me back off and check in a couple days later? The answer to that question was so helpful because in the midst of tension, I knew exactly how to respond. And I think what we'll find is that true leadership is serving. It's not from a position of power. It's not from a place where you're telling someone what to do. I think great leaders actually feel like the people that they serve are more valuable than they are. Because without them, they wouldn't be leaders in the first place. Leadership is a lot about showing versus telling. I want to see my leader act out the core values, act out the mission and vision of the company. I don't want to hear them spout stuff off and then be hypocrites and do the opposite thing. That's called a politician. Leaders value character over competence. Think about it. You may get hired for things that are in your resume, mostly hard skills. But you get remembered and or you get fired for soft skills. That's sort of a sombering look at it, but that's the reality. Leaders really try to get to know a person. When you hear a testimony of a leader who had an impact on you, it's always a personal story. It usually has little to do with a title or position, but a lot to do with how that person makes them feel. And influencing and impacting someone based on how you treat them is definitely a soft skill. In fact, I don't want you to think that leadership is nothing but good stuff, because it's not. Quite frankly, if you knew the responsibility that leader took on, you probably wouldn't want to do it. You know, leaders who are really in it for the right reasons, when they achieve victory, they're going to actually pass the praise around to the team and not take much of it. But the big thing is when things go wrong, even if they didn't do it directly, they're going to take the blame. They're going to take the hit for their team. And for that reason alone, a lot of people don't want to be in leadership. So what I am telling you is that leadership is an honor, but it's also a responsibility. In fact, going back to the idea of it not being positive, but sometimes being tough or negative, think about the idea of having tough conversations. We all have to have those things. And as leaders, I don't think anyone really looks forward to them. But what I will go back to is if you have built a relationship with trust, great listening, empathizing, then you've earned the right. And let me emphasize, you've earned the right to have those tough conversations. Those tough conversations that would go possibly far south end up turning out pretty well. Because you know why? Because the person, even though the feedback or criticism may be harsh, they know it's coming from a good place because they trust you. And they believe that what you're telling them is only to make them better, that it's not personal, that they're trying to be as objective as possible, but they also have a job to do. And you have to understand that. But what if they didn't have that relationship with you? It's easy to take it personal, right? If you consider your manager a micromanager, really what you're saying is that you don't trust them. And maybe it's because they don't trust you. And the question would be, how do you earn that trust? And I think it's a mixture of all the things that I mentioned already. So your goal as a leader is to build trust. And how do you do that? You do that through building a strong relationship with them. It takes time, but from experience, it's definitely worth it. It's worth the investment. Let's move on to the third point, emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence is always also known as EQ. And the question is, what is EQ? Well, EQ is the ability to manage your emotions with others. That means that you literally sometimes have to play a third person to yourself before you react emotionally. That's having extreme self-awareness. That's having extreme self-regulation. And it's also sometimes slowing things down when things are going really fast. It's really more of a choice and an effort than it is a skill, in a way. Listen to this stat. I think this is very powerful. Daniel Goleman, he wrote the book Emotional Intelligence at Work. He states that 90% of what moves a person up the success ladder is emotional intelligence. And people who are top achievers in their role have 2 times as much of it as someone who is average, while people in senior roles have 4 times as much of it. So emotional intelligence is literally what's going to make or break you. I believe that every great leader, regardless of the industry, is self-aware. Now, self-awareness can mean different things to different people. But what it comes down to is how well do you know your strengths and how well do you know your weaknesses? You can't help other people if you can't help yourself first. Think about this. What are you saying to yourself on a consistent basis? What is the self-talk that's going on in your head? How aware of it are you? Sometimes what we say to ourselves becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Let me give you an example. For myself, up until about 5 or 6 years ago, I used to shy away from speaking opportunities. Granted, I've had leadership roles for a good part of my life. And I would do speaking opportunities, but I would do them really reluctantly. The problem is that my mentality was off. I was always telling myself, speaking is just not my thing. But for some reason, the light bulb went off about 5 years ago. I realized because I was telling myself that I'm not a good speaker, I performed like a not very good speaker. And so in order for me to change that, I had to change my mindset. And I started saying to myself, I want to be a great speaker. Now, just saying it is not going to change it. But that's really where it starts. Because after that, I started to watch more tape on people. I watched TED Talks. I used to look at stand-up comedians. I would pick up things from speakers that I really respected. But really what got me better is just getting out there and doing it. So I started volunteering to speak. And at first, I definitely did not get the results I wanted. And as I started to gain more and more confidence, I realized the next step was to speak at larger gatherings and also to record myself and watch the video. And as humiliating as it was for me to sit there and watch myself, there's nothing that beats visual feedback. And eventually, a year ago, that's when I challenged myself to do a TED Talk because it was a little bit more than I was comfortable with. But that's what I felt like I needed to do to get over that hump. And when people ask me, why did you do a TED Talk? Well, one of the big reasons why I did it was to prove it to myself. Now, have opportunities come because of it? Sure, they have. But really, the goal of achieving it was more for me than it was for anyone else. So what I want to do is walk you through an activity of self-talk, because that really is where emotional intelligence lies first. It starts with you, right? And then it goes out to other people. So I'll use the example I just gave you in an equation. And this equation is something that you can plug in and you can use yourself because it's very flexible. So I'd like you to think of the 3 letters T, F, A. and put an arrow in between each of them. So T flows to F and F flows to A. And you're going to put 2 lines of that. So TFA on top, TFA on the bottom. And here's why. So T stands for thought, F stands for feeling, and A stands for action, and sometimes actually for inaction. So I'll use the example of speaking. So first, the negative self-talk I was saying to myself, or the thought, was, I'm not a good speaker, or speaking is just not my thing. How did that make me feel? Not very confident, insecure, sometimes feeling a little out of place. How did it affect my performance? Or what action did it have on me? Well, I would reluctantly take opportunities. I would not look forward to them, and sometimes I would avoid them. Now, when you go down to the bottom row, where do I have to start? What do I need to change? I need to change what I'm saying to myself. So instead of saying speaking is not my thing, or I'm not a good speaker, I had to change it to I want to be a great speaker. How did that change the way I felt? Well, it made me feel a lot more confident. I knew it was going to be a journey. I knew it was going to be a process, but it was something that I wanted to change. So I needed to change the way I thought about it. And eventually, like I said, after practice and going at it a lot of times, I feel like I got a lot better. In a way, doing the TED Talk was more of a relief than it was an accomplishment, because I feel like my best speaking is ahead of me, not behind me. So essentially what I did with that TFA was I flipped a negative I statement to a positive one. And in order to be or be at a level of high emotional intelligence, that's something that you're going to have to do quite often, because you're going to have doubts. You're going to have things that are intimidating. You're going to have things that are going to stand in your way, obstacles. But the only way to get over them is to change their mindset with them. Once again, emotional intelligence starts with you, and then it spills over to others. So the best way to approach it in a systematic way is to observe what you're doing, reflect on it, evaluate it, then rinse and repeat. You know, using a leadership example in terms of emotional intelligence, is the reality is 50%, half of a manager's time is spent sorting out interpersonal conflict. So that means if you're working 50 to 60 hours a week as a manager, that 25 to 30 hours of your week are going to be spent with infighting, customer service problems, your boss complaining to you about stuff that isn't getting done by your team. Once again, I'm not trying to scare you away from this stuff. I'm just letting you know that this is why emotional intelligence as a soft skill is so important. Because as you climb up that ladder, you actually need more of it, not less of it. So the more you avoid improving your soft skills, quite frankly, the less chance you have to achieve and get higher up in your career. Now, I realize everyone doesn't want to necessarily peak at a manager's role, and that's fine. But think about it. In your role right now, how often do you deal with people? Maybe you work solo. Maybe you work contract. You're probably working from home right now. But that only gets you so far. You're going to have to eventually communicate with people, be on a team, potentially lead a project. And if you're going to do that and do it successfully, you're really going to have to improve your soft skills. The goal in emotional intelligence is to increase your self-awareness. And by doing that, it builds EQ. And really the cool part about this is that focusing on your self-awareness is focusing on something that you can control, not something that you can't control. So let's summarize what we've learned. Soft skills are learned or mastered through practice and repetition only. So I like to say that soft skills are not learned in the classroom. They're learned in the real world. So this picture, this image that you see right now, is a picture of a gym with weights in it. And the idea is that if you want to get stronger, there's no diet, there's no overnight program that's going to get you the results that you want. You're going to have to work at it. You're going to have to put in the reps to get better. And so with communication, leadership, and emotional intelligence as the three that I chose to talk about today with soft skills, those are things that you're going to have to practice. And if you're not willing to practice, you're not going to get better at them. But understand that if you're willing to make the investment, it's going to pay off dividends regardless of the industry that you're in, even if you decide to pivot into a different industry later. You know, there's no substitution for real-world experience. You only get better at human interaction by doing it. So right now, when we're somewhat isolated from a lot of the people that we want to see, I actually think it's a perfect opportunity for you to practice your soft skills. Maybe you won't get as much practice in person, but like I said before, we're all on Zoom. We all do virtual meetings and presentations. Hey, hopping on a phone call is not bad either. If you have to communicate via text or email, you got to do that too. But if you want to improve your soft skills, you're going to have to put in the work. You're going to have to put in the time. But understand, especially in technology roles, that technology is actually powered by humans. They're the ones who created the technology in the first place. So as much as you feel like maybe, as an engineer or something, that you don't really need to deal with soft skills, that's really wrong. You do. So some industries, I will say that you maybe don't need as strong of hard skills, but every industry, in order to succeed at any position really, soft skills are going to come in handy. So I'm hoping that today you were able to take at least one thing away. That the importance of soft skills is something that you can benefit from for the rest of your life. That regardless of how things evolve in your career or even in your personal life, you could never get to the point where you can't improve your soft skills even more. So I want to thank you for joining me today. And I hope that you're able to improve your soft skills and get those hard results that you really strive to see. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to hearing your progress.